Of Blood and Steel, written by Seymour Zainali, narrated by James Lawrence. Chapter 11. Nightmares and Daydreams. Arda and Balak headed north of Balak and toward a lush, dark green forest that bordered Elania. This would lead them on to Amida. They traveled over the grasslands for several kilometers. The yellows and greens sparkled in the sunlight. Their crisp, woody freshness was complemented by the fragrance from red and purple wildflowers blown by a wisp of wind. Arda picked some and put them in her satchel. They spent the first hour of their journey soaking up the view. It was a nice day, not too hot and not too cold. Arda broke the silence. "Do you have a family, Balak?"
"I'm afraid not."
"No kids?"
"None."
"But you must have been in love at some point." Balak paused.
"Once, when I was a young man, I did love a girl. She had hair blacker than darkness and a heart full of passion. I met her when I was injured in battle. When I was on the mend, I helped her family by fixing things and doing chores. It didn't work out for us."
"What happened?" Arda asked.
"I had some unfinished business to tend to. By the time I returned, years later, she was carrying someone else's child."
"Oh, I'm sorry."
"Don't be. I would have been a lousy father."
"You don't actually mean that, do you?" Arda laughed. Balak said nothing. Arda noticed some nettles on the ground, so she picked some and stored them in her bag. After a quick stop to feed and change the child, they continued walking for kilometers. There was a sting in the breeze as it got later into the afternoon, so Arda was relieved when they headed into the shelter of the forest, although it didn't stop her from shivering. Balak noticed her reaction.
"If it's going to be a freezing night, maybe we should set up camp," he said.
"Is it too early?"
"I suggest we rest here. We've made good progress today. By the end of tomorrow, we'll be halfway to the iron gates."
Arda nodded in agreement. They sat down between two golden-leaf oak trees, and Balak built a fire. Arda rolled the ground lamb she had bought from the market into medium-sized balls and threw them into the cooking pot with some herbs that included parsley, fenugreek, and mint. She added a cup of water and brought the mixture to a boil, then let it simmer on a low heat. She stirred her mixture with a large stick. Balak sat around the fire while Arda fed and changed the child. Once the food was ready, Arda shared it. She took some flatbreads from her satchel and passed one to Balak. The bread still smelled fresh, and the center had stayed warm while wrapped in fabric.
"Get some rest. We'll set off early,"
Balak told her as he settled against one of the oaks. He lay in front of the stump between its entwined branches, which hung low. Arda fell asleep in an instant, and Balak soon followed. He awoke abruptly to the sound of rustling leaves on the ground. He opened his eyes gently to see if it was an animal, but saw nothing. He closed his eyes before hearing another rustle, this time closer. He pretended to sleep, still leaning against a tree. He felt a rope getting tight around his neck.
"Arda, we're under attack,"
he yelled as he tried to grab his axe. Tarlin stepped out and made himself known. He thrust his fist into Balak's damaged rib and pushed the axe farther out of his reach.
"Oomph!"
Balak's legs buckled as he took another painful blow. Arda woke up and rushed to her spear, but before she could reach it, Tarlin grabbed her by her hair. He threw the spear away from her and started to drag her across the ground. Arda cried out as the twigs and stones tore holes in her clothes and scraped her skin raw.
"I'm sorry it came to this, but I'm going to make you feel the pain I felt," he told her.
He pulled out a dagger with his right hand and thrust it forward, aiming for Balak's healing wound.
"Die, you shit-eating dog!"
proclaimed Tarlin as he twisted the knife, pushing it in deeper. Balak groaned loudly, and Arda grabbed a small burning tree branch from the fire. She hit Tarlin with it. The branch broke in half and set Tarlin's clothes on fire. Tarlin turned toward Arda and began to choke her. He didn't notice the smoldering smoke slowly rising from his clothes. His choking was interrupted by a sudden rush of pain as the flames shot up and covered his body. He shrieked and dropped Arda. She watched in horror as he ran around in panic, patting his clothes and squealing, but the breeze caused the flames to move faster until he was completely covered. He dropped down to the ground, shrieking and writhing in pain as his whole body glowed, but soon the shrieking stopped, and Tarlin's charred corpse lay still. Tarlin's men looked on in horror, and they loosened their grip on the rope. Balak used this distraction to reach his axe and cut his restraints, making the two men holding each end of the strand fall on their bums. Arda took a few steps backward before falling. Fortunately, Balak rushed to catch her.
"Arda, are you all right? Speak to me, girl,"
he said cautiously, but the words might not have reached her as the child was screaming. Arda's legs gave out, and she collapsed to the ground, wrapping her hands around her body and weeping. The few remaining men fled as Balak catapulted quickly to his feet.
"Arda, calm down."
He put his hand on her shoulder, and she held him tightly. "I am sorry," she stuttered as she kept staring at the burning corpse of Tarlin. Balak turned around to see where Arda was looking. He grabbed her face and told her,
"Don't look at it. Look at me. Listen to my voice."
Arda looked into Balak's eyes.
"Good. It's me, Balak. Breathe with me."
Balak took a deep, slow breath in and waited for Arda to do the same. She repeated Balak's action. He smiled and sat her down, turning her away from the corpse.
"Good. Now keep going. Deep breaths, in and out."
He quickly got up and covered the body before the smell could attract any wildlife, then returned to Arda. He sat behind her, gently wrapping his large hands around her and calming her down.
Shh, girl. You did the right thing."
Over the next few days, Arda was quiet and withdrawn. She slept a lot and hardly ate. Their journey was long, but they made barely any progress and were constantly camping as the fall got closer to winter. At night, Balak pretended to sleep, but instead he listened to Arda. At first he thought it was the baby until he realized it was Arda's body that was shaking while the infant lay calm in her basket. They headed across to the Amadan border, but the uneven path was difficult. Arda was weak and stumbled with the child. She broke down, and they stopped again. The unharmed child peeked through her blankets and smiled at Balak. Balak set up camp early, and Arda stared at the flickering yellow flame.
"You should probably lie down and get some rest," he told her.
Without saying anything or arguing, she complied. Balak patrolled the borders of their small camp, but upon his return, Arda's palm slowly crept toward the fire. He pulled her hand away, but she'd already burned the center of her hand. Luckily, there was no permanent damage. Balak wrapped it in a clutch of sheet to prevent infection.
"Arda, what were you thinking?"
I don't know. I can still see his face," she told Balak. "Does it ever go away?"
"It gets easier,"
Balak lied.
"Here."
He offered her his drink. She accepted and gulped down almost half of the flask before spitting most of it out. "What is it?" Arda asked with a shaky voice.
"Medicine,"
Balak said. "Is that what you've been drinking all this time?"
"It's an acquired taste."
Arda smiled as she tried to take another sip.
"Get some rest," he said. "I'll keep watch."
Arda lay by the fire and quickly fell asleep. Balak sat, leaning against a tree, sipping on the drink from his flask. He heard the baby crying.
Arda, the child,
he told her, but she was too deep in her dreams, and the child kept screaming.
Fine,
he whispered to himself as he got up and headed toward the basket with the child. The child looked up at him with wide eyes.
Your sister is asleep, he told her. It's just the two of us.
He lifted the child from the basket.
Now, what do you need?
She continued to cry.
Be quiet,
he told her, but she screamed harder.
No, shush,
he said sternly through gritted teeth. The child started to fuss and moan.
How do you communicate with someone who doesn't know how?
The child reached out and grabbed his finger. Balak relaxed a bit and looked down. She pulled his finger toward her mouth, but he slipped it away and she started sucking on her own hand. Balak's facial features softened as he felt the child calm down a little. He smirked.
You must be hungry.
He lit a fire and warmed some milk, just like Arda had done so many times before. The child fidgeted and moaned. Balak began to feed her, and she kicked her legs excitedly in response.
Drink, and one day you will be as strong and smart as your sister. The things we do to keep our family safe.
After the child finished drinking, Balak lifted her and started rocking her gently until she vomited on him.
By the Maker!
The child gurgled and grinned as Balak's laugh turned to a groan.
A little warning next time.
The child was sleeping soundly when Balak put her back in the basket. I didn't know you two had grown closer, Arda said gently, pleasantly surprised.
I didn't want to wake you up. Me and, what's her name, anyway?
Name? I don't know.
You don't know? Haven't your parents named her?
This wasn't on their minds. There was too much chaos in the days leading up to the king's death. She can be Lilith, maybe Mariam.
How about Malika?
Malika. I will have to think about it.
Sleep on it. We should get back to bed.
As he stretched his arms, Arda noticed a damp patch on his ribs. Balak, you're bleeding. Remove your clothing, she demanded, and started to rummage through her satchel. She pulled out a bowl and some bandages, then ground together some leaves and water and heated the mixture on the embers of the fire. Balak began to remove his top, but it was stuck to the wound.
"Oh, yeah,"
he groaned as he peeled his top away. It's easier if you lie down, Arda told him. Without protesting, Balak obeyed. The mud was cold on his back, and its grit scrubbed against his skin. Arda spread the mixture over the wound and saw that the stitches had started to pull apart. She grabbed her needle and thread.
Stop.
Stay still. It's going to get worse before it gets better.
Fine,
he barked through gritted teeth. Arda examined Balak's wound. It was purple, and at the top, where the wound was splitting the stitches, it was inflamed and red. Arda put a couple stitches in his wound, and Balak jumped with the first insertion of the needle. Yellow seeped from the wound, and Arda cleaned it with water before she wrapped it back up in a bandage. We'll have to keep an eye on it.
It feels better.
That's because the infection has come out. Hopefully, that's all of it. What are those? Arda traced the scars over the markings on the right side of Balak's chest.
Just a bad scar.
Who did it to you?
No one.
You did it to yourself? Balak didn't reply. You tried to cover the markings, didn't you? I've seen those before. Balak ran his fingers over the scars covering the markings. These tattoos are marks of servitude, she said. You were a slave.
I was taken as a child. I recall my father protecting us to his very last breath.
I'm sorry to hear that. What about your mother?
She helped me escape. I ran as fast and as long as my feet could carry me. I could hear the dogs and men chasing me. I only stopped when I couldn't keep myself standing. That night was the last time I saw her. She died as a slave.
I'm very sorry to hear that, Balak.
You've got nothing to be sorry about. Can we rest now?
He said as he turned to the side and covered himself with the blanket. Sure, Balak.